Unit 2, Research Paradigms. 2.1 Introduction. The development of the domain of counseling and family therapy is being shaped by technological and demographic factors as well as experiences of the individuals. These components bring in changes rapidly and radically. In other words, you can say that research is essential to know the effect of changes on the family patterns, parental authority, mental well-being, etc., so that future interventions in the field of counseling and family therapy can be shaped according to the results of the present study and previous developments. It will later help to provide a base for decision-making and policy formation. This would also lead to the development of useful innovative techniques in the area of counseling and family therapy. There is always a concern for directing research activities in counseling and family therapy to the real needs of the participants and society. As a student of counseling and family therapy, we hope that this unit will familiarize you with the developing traditions of research activities in counseling and family therapy and help you to understand why research is directed towards certain problems or phenomena and to design and conduct basic as well as applied research. The unit deals with the models, patterns, or ways in which you can go about conducting research in counseling and family therapy. We will inform you of the possibilities, approaches and limitations of various tools and techniques, models, etc. This will enable you to analyze, theorize, and pose questions which deal with a large number of counseling and family therapy issues, macro perspectives involving social effects, impact of counseling and family therapy, and communication issues. This unit will serve as a guide for beginners for doing research in counseling and family therapy. It is assumed that the field of counseling and family therapy has produced and will continue to yield growing bodies of knowledge. But knowledge does not grow naturally or inexorably. It is produced through the critical inquiries of practitioners or scholars, and is therefore a function of the kinds of questions asked, problems posed, and issues framed by those who conduct researches. To understand the methods and findings of research carried out in the field of counseling and family therapy, one should appreciate and utilize the varieties of ways in which research questions are formulated. The framing of research questions, like that of an advocate asking questions in a court of law, limits the range of permissible responses and prefigures the character of possible outcomes. In other words, it is essential that a researcher understands the questions that have been asked and the manner in which those questions have been framed, both conceptually and methodologically. As a researcher, you should know why research is formulated in a specific fashion, what the alternative approaches to inquiry are, how to work on a research project, how to select a tool, and how to prepare a design for research. The paradigms of research will provide you a solid background in each of the research discourses and allow you to explore the trends of research from a global perspective. In a way, these paradigms inform us about problems and procedures which are consistent with researching within a specific social, cultural, economic, and political framework. Keeping in view the above facts, this unit provides you with a detailed discussion pertaining to paradigms of research. Objectives. After studying this unit, you will be able to describe the concept of paradigm, distinguish between the three paradigms of research, explain the approaches to research in counseling and family therapy, and list the different areas of research in counseling and family therapy. 2.2 Research Paradigms in Counseling and Family Therapy. There are a number of issues pertaining to the nature of research in counseling and family therapy. For example, whether the proposed research topic is as per the need of the situation. How shall the topic be viewed by the wider community of professionals in counseling and family therapy engaged in research activities? What sort of theoretical interpretation might lie behind the research questions? What is the status of research in counseling and family therapy, and how to theorize and generate knowledge? Here is the text with spelling mistakes. How shall the topic be viewed by the wider community of professionals in counseling and family therapy engaged in research activities? What sort of theoretical interpretation might lie behind the research questions? What is the status of research in counseling and family therapy, and how to theorize and generate knowledge? What sort of theoretical interpretation might lie behind the research questions? What is the status of research in counselling and family therapy, and how to theorise and generate knowledge in counselling and family therapy? To answer these questions, it would be useful to introduce the idea of various models and approaches to research. Many researchers have talked about the way scientists use models known as maps or paradigms to develop frameworks for counselling and family therapy research. The paradigm approach provides a solid background in each research exercise and helps us to follow up in depth specific areas. This background is an essential part of the development of models in counselling and family therapy research. There is always a concern for directing research activity in counselling and family therapy to the real needs of the participants. It is also essential to connect research in counselling and family therapy and social sciences. For example, there are some commonalities between much of what occurs in counselling and family therapy and the work done with individualised instruction, independent study, and technology. The research should deal with micro-perspectives such as the use of cognitive behavioural therapy to control drug abuse and macro-perspectives involving social and political influences on individual family and therapeutic processes. The concept and genesis of research paradigms. The concept of paradigm has turned out to be useful in inspiring critical thinking about normal science and the way shifts in basic scientific thinking occur. A paradigm determines the criteria according to which one selects and defines problems for inquiry and how one approaches them theoretically and methodologically. A paradigm could also be regarded as a cultural artifact, reflecting the dominant notions about scientific behavior in a particular scientific community, be it national or international, and at a particular point in time. In other words, we can say that paradigms determine scientific approaches and procedures which stand out as exemplary to the new generation of scientists, as long as they do not oppose them. A revolution in the world of scientific paradigm occurs when one or several researchers at a given time encounter anomalies. For example, they may conduct experimental studies, make observations, which in a remarkable way do not fit the prevailing paradigm. Such anomalies can give rise to a crisis, after which the universe of research under study is perceived in an entirely new light. Previous theories and facts become subject to thorough rethinking and re-evaluation. It is relatively easy to point out changes in paradigms in natural sciences. For example, in physics, a paradigm shift occurred from Aristotle via Galileo and Newton to Einstein. But when research activities in social sciences emerged in the 19th century, a conflict was observed in the field of research concerning both the purpose and method of inquiry. Alternative perspectives have been proposed and accepted by many. The value of alternative approaches was not denied, since scholarly debates and the exploratory use of these alternative approaches add vitality to the field. During the 1960s and 1970s, scholars from different social science disciplines studied educational problems with many disciplinary affiliations. Most of them have a background in psychology or other behavioral sciences, but quite a few of them have a humanities background in philosophy and literature. Thus, there cannot be a single paradigm prevailing, like in the normal science, in the multifaceted field of research in counselling and family therapy. So, the scholars contributed new methods and new perspectives. Some scholars argue that there are two main paradigms, the scientific, and the humanistic, which are not exclusive, but complementary to each other. Nevertheless, it can be argued that the drawing of a distinction between these two approaches cannot be sustained to the extent that they are regarded as two different paradigms. The 20th century has seen the conflict between these two as employed in researching aspects and issues pertaining to counselling and family therapy. The one, which is modelled on the natural sciences, shows emphasis on empirical quantifiable observations and analyses data with mathematical tools. The other paradigm is derived from the humanities, with an emphasis on holistic and qualitative information for interpreting data. A review of relevant literature indicates four major paradigms: empirical analytic, roughly equivalent to quantitative science; interpretive symbolic, qualitative or hermeneutical inquiry; critical, where criteria relating to human betterment are applied in research. IV. Phenomenography. Examine each of these in detail. NOS 2.2.1 Empiricist Paradigm. This paradigm emphasizes careful and controlled observation as the basis for knowledge. The observer is dispassionate and independent of the object of observation. Knowledge is objective, generalizable, and can be used to predict and control future events. Smith et al., 1990. In other words, within an empiricist research paradigm, the activities or processes proceed in a hypothetico-deductive way. Here, we have a theory behind the particular problem we wish to investigate. The theory provides the concepts which pose the research problem. The hypotheses arise from the theoretical framework made up from the concepts and variables interacting with each other. Holmberg, 1990, 159. Emphasized that scholarly work that tests propositions and modifies theoretical approaches has to be intersubjectively rational, exact, and of non-partisan character. Since research processes, according to this view, should proceed by the hypothetico-deductive problem method, you need to have some kind of theory for a particular problem you wish to investigate. This theory or model will provide the language and concepts which pose the problem. Your hypotheses will arise from the theoretical framework made up from the way the concepts or variables interact with each other. For example, suppose you want to explore the relationship between school dropouts and socio-economic status. For this problem, the following hypotheses can be formulated with the eventual aim of operationalizing the statements and finding ways of empirically testing them. These hypotheses are: 1. Socio-economic status of the family influences school dropouts. 2. Emotional involvement in the study promotes deep learning and goal attainment. You can notice that if we are to move to an empirical approach for testing the above hypotheses, we face a problem of deciding what we might measure, how to go about measuring emotional involvement, deep learning, and goal attainment. So, within empiricist research, a hypothesis must focus on a meaningful problem and have clearly defined concepts. After this, to verify our assertion that there exists a relationship between emotional involvement and deep learning, we have to construct and conduct the test. We also have to design the research activity, whether to select the experimental approach or any other method. If we decide to be experimental in our approach, we have to manipulate the extent of emotional involvement to see whether there is any effect on deep learning. Who will be our subjects? Also, we have to take into account the practical and ethical considerations in attempting this empiricist approach. You can see that you have to prepare a typical pattern for the empiricist approach. The steps involved are problem posing, hypothesis generation, choice of research design, data collection, data analysis, reporting. Deriving a theory is a deductive principle, but a theory which is based on evidence can be proved only by the inductive approach. For example, a researcher observes again and again that friendly communication, feelings of belonging and personal relations between learner and teacher influences not only but also achievement favorably. General opinion among educators supports the researcher in assuming that what he/she has induced from the cases is based on the theory or a law. A theory to this effect is developed and various hypotheses are derived from it, and in fact, agree with what has been noticed in practice and tried empirically. In other words, assumptions are then deduced from theory. 2.2.2 Interpretive Paradigm Phenomenology. This paradigm emphasizes social interaction as the basis of knowledge. The researchers use their skills as social actors to understand the subjective worlds of others. Here, knowledge is subjective, constructed through mutual negotiation, and is specific to the situation under investigation. The difference between empiricist and interpretive paradigms is that the empiricist approach focuses on prediction and control, but the interpretive approach is concerned with the understanding of a particular situation by the researcher. The interpretive approach focuses on the intentions behind human actions, seeks to uncover and interpret the meanings of all that is happening, being done, or being understood by those who are involved in the activity under investigation. Noonan, 1990, 26. This type of research includes qualitative methods of study. Here, the focus is on the observed present, but the findings are contextualized within a social, cultural, and historical framework. The dominant influence within the interpretive paradigm can be seen in research on students' approach to learning. The research study focusing on students' learning, particularly following the phenomenography of Martin and Saljo, 1976, explained the deep and the surface approaches. The idea of approaches to learning, though apparently simple, is very useful in understanding why students learn differently under the same circumstances. It is not a learning style inherent in students which they manifest in all situations, but a characteristic of interaction between an individual and the learning task. So, it is the interpretation of an intention and an action. It only has meaning with reference to a situation with certain types of content. From the phenomenography approach, Martin and Saljo, 1976, came to this important point about distinguishing deep from surface learning and explained that students would adopt the means of processing academic tasks according to their intentions or perception of their future. If learners merely wished to display symptoms of having learned, they would adopt a surface-level approach. If they wanted to grow in understanding, they would adopt a deep-level strategy. From the above discussion, you must have realized the impact of the interpretive paradigm on deep and surface levels of learning. But what is the phenomenological approach? Let us discuss briefly about two phenomenological approaches before we proceed to the strengths and limitations of the interpretive paradigm. Phenomenology. It is concerned with an interpretive understanding of human action. As a philosophical movement, phenomenology was founded by Edmund Husserl. Its main concern is to provide philosophy with a foundation that will enable it to be a pure and autonomous discipline, free from all presuppositions. Its method is essentially descriptive, and its aims are to uncover the fundamental structures of intention, consciousness, and the life world. The idea of the life world of lived experience, which is always taken for granted even by empirical sciences, is one of the two main concepts of phenomenology, which has interested many social scientists, including psychologists. Nevertheless, critics have argued that when phenomenological concepts are transferred from their original domain to the context of social science, their meaning is radically transformed. In a wider context, we can say that phenomenology has influenced researchers' analysis of the constructs and the interpretation of reality. For example, an important point about students' learning approaches is that one depends upon the student's perception of the course, the teaching, and the learning environment. A range of constructs such as heavy workload, didactic teaching, content-oriented assessment, and a fact-filled syllabus has been consistently met with a surface approach. The constructs made by the researcher through phenomenological analysis in a learning environment help to study the behavior of the learner as the researcher tries to explain in accordance with the constructs whether the learner has deep or surface-level learning. The phenomenological analysis of learning approaches has provided the researchers with interpretable tools which are sensitive to the context of the department or the individual learner or teacher. So it helps in designing courses and planning curricula more conducive to students employing a deep approach. Phenomenological and interpretive researches derive their responses from the subject and blur the distinction between subjects and objects. Phenomenological concern attends to how subjects make sense of the world. How do learners, teachers, or others interpret social practices and situations in which they find themselves? Phenomenologists look to the object of study for descriptive first-order constructs. What were formerly objects, for example, students, teachers, or educational administrators, are now subjects. Phenomenologists adopt an attitude of epoche, where past beliefs, opinions, attitudes, experiences, ideologies, and frames of reference are set aside so that the discourse of research emanates from the subjects. Subjects expose first-order constants by which they organize and make sense of their daily lives. Researchers then develop second-order scientific and explanatory constructs that account for first-order constructs. Some issues, such as defining the perceived social situation and collecting data through unstructured and informal approaches, should be handled properly to collect relevant information. In any interpretive study, The researcher may sometimes receive information which is not intended for public disclosure. Being a participant and an observer, the researcher carries a number of responsibilities to deal with a particular situation with moral considerations, because the construction of meaning from an observational account and informal interviews is a key activity in the interpretive paradigm. The limitation of the interpretive paradigm is that there is no inherent mechanism for moving beyond interpretation. If this paradigm is followed, the researcher depends on the level of interpretation, and there is no mechanism for moving on towards remediating the identified problems. 2.2.3 Critical Paradigm. The critical paradigm emphasizes that knowledge is problematic and capable of systematic distortion. It represents the interests of some groups within society and has the potential to be either oppressive or emancipating. This approach shares the assumptions of the interpretive approach, but adds the above element. One of the concerns of the critical paradigm is to understand the theory as well as practices. Now, to reconceptualize this research activity, let's take the example of learning styles of a distance learner. In this case, our first concern will be to try and understand the practices of distance learners as they engage in learning. As a participant in this research, the researcher will be setting up strategies which involve learners in critical reflections about their actions as learners at a distance. The researcher has to listen to their language and conceptual understanding of the way in which the learners are emotionally involved in influencing their abilities to learn and attain their goals. The researcher may anticipate the introduction of social and political contexts in this approach. Sometimes the researcher may change the situation in order to provide a greater degree of control to the learner. For example, warmth in human relations and rapport with teachers at a distance could be collectively redefined in ways which change the practices of those attempting to facilitate learning at a distance. The use of collective redefined actions by previously isolated independent students to achieve changes in their involvement within the educational enterprise may also be explored. This is because the critical paradigm sees knowledge developing as participants are actively involved in construction and reconstruction of theory and practice. The approaches involved in this paradigm are emancipatory praxis and critical pragmatism. For example, emancipatory praxis identifies a guidance role for expert researchers in facilitating involvement of participants. Critical ethnography supports emancipatory action, and critical pragmatism extends beyond the typical critical approach and helps for post-structural analysis. In the critical paradigm, the researcher has to identify the social group of the participants' subjects through dialogue and analysis of the intentions of the participants. She or he has to study the historical development of the social conditions and the current social structure to understand the group. The researcher has to collect data with the help of participant observation and in-depth interview. She or he has to involve herself or himself to visualize the social situation. The key feature of this paradigm is its concern for finding the truth or facts without distortion or bias. It focuses on sociological and political issues as a research problem. One mode of research associated with the critical paradigm is action research, which is a form of participatory and collaborative research. Action research aims to help practitioners investigate the connections between their own theories and the day-to-day practices. It aims to integrate the research act into the educational setting so that research can play a direct and immediate role in the improvement of practice. 2.2.4 Phenomenography and Second-Order Perspective. Phenomenography has been extensively dealt with by Martin, 1997. According to him, phenomenography is the empirical study of the limited number of qualitatively different ways in which various phenomena in and aspects of the world around are experienced, conceptualized, understood, perceived, and apprehended. Phenomeноgraphers call it a second-order perspective, Martin, 1981. This point can be explained with the help of an example taken from a piece of phenomenographic research. One of the ways in which children experience numbers is as fingers numbers, which is stated by New 1987 and quoted by Marton, 1997. Children frequently lay the numbers 1 to 10 in their fingers, present in two hands, calling one of the little fingers 1, 1, the ring finger 2, and so on. Numbers larger than 5 are then understood as 5 plus some fingers. In carrying out simple arithmetical tasks, children try to keep the undivided 5 together. Hence, when solving problems like 2 plus 7 equals 9, they reverse the addends and transform the problem to 7 plus 2 geese, where 7 is undivided as 5 plus 2, and the problem as a whole becomes 5 plus 2 equals. From the above example, you can understand a concept of something or a way of experiencing something. The two expressions are being used interchangeably. It is a way of being aware of a phenomenon. One might be aware of 7 when one perceives it as 5 plus 2. When one looks at one's hand, or as 6 plus 1 or 4 plus 3, it might be all immediate experience of the number 7. It might be the result of reflection or some other possibilities. So, here the perceptions differ in a qualitative way. Phenomenography is a research specialization. The research was carried out at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, in the early 1970s. The point of departure for these studies was one of the simplest observations that can be made about learning, namely that some people do better at learning than others. These observations led to the first question, which was to be investigated empirically. What does it mean to say that some people are better at learning than others? This in turn led to the second question, B. Why are some people better at learning than others? This phenomenographical study was carried out with individual tasks provided to the learners under comparatively natural conditions, and learners were allowed to read the text provided to them. Thus, after completing their reading, the students were interviewed about what they understood the text to have been about. The interview also pertained to their experience of the situation, and they were specifically asked how they had gone about learning the text. All the interviews were recorded and subsequently transcribed verbatim. On examining the transcripts of the students' accounts of how they had understood and remembered the text as a whole, it was found that there were different ways of understanding the text. Thus, a hierarchically ordered set of categories were devised and termed the outcome space. By referring to this outcome space, the categories of description could be compared with one another to judge how appropriate, in relation to specified criteria, the understanding they represented was. Thus, a way was found for answering the second question as to why are some people better at learning than others. Further research for answering the second question demonstrated the relationship between approaches to learning, that is, surface and deep on the one hand, and the quality of the outcomes on the other. This phenomenographic study developed the notion of two approaches to learning. The idea of approaches to learning is very useful in understanding why individuals react differently in the same circumstance. Thus, two key issues regarding phenomenographic study are: 1. Different ways of understanding a specific content which learners developed in a certain situation. Sense was made of these in terms of differences in the approaches the learners adopted to the specific learning task. That is, in terms of differences in their ways of experiencing the specific situation. 2. The second issue is that in developing the phenomenographic research, the focus of interest was to shift away from that which emerges in a specific situation and toward the learner's preconceived ideas about the phenomena dealt with in the specific situation. For example, the way in which children understand numbers is of vital importance to the way in which they deal with problems in arithmetic. Can you envisage a similar example pertaining to some other aspect of human cognition, affect, and behavior? The above discussion points out that phenomenography is the empirical study of the limited number of qualitatively different ways in which various phenomena can be experienced, understood, perceived, and conceptualized. This may be considered as a way of finding out how the development of knowledge and skills within the domains can be facilitated. In this section, we discuss the research paradigms in the domain of counseling and family therapy, which have significant potential for research studies. Having presented to you the 4 research paradigms, we shall now examine a few methodological issues and approaches. 2.3 Approaches to Counseling and Family Therapy Research. In the above discussion, we saw how a research method is a particular way of studying a problem. With the increasing number of research studies in counseling and family therapy, much emphasis is laid on methodological issues and approaches to research in this field. In this section, we will present to you a few issues and approaches to research. These approaches will provide you with guidelines by which you can design a research problem, develop field techniques to collect data, interpret data, and arrive at generalizations. 2.3.1 Qualitative and Quantitative Approaches. Qualitative methods help us to examine the nature of human behavior and experience and social conditions, but quantitative methods focus on objective and standardized means of inquiry and application of statistical analysis for the attainment of objectivity and generalizations. Qualitative methods permit the researcher to study selected issues, cases, or events in depth. Qualitative data are collected through direct observation, participant observation, in-depth interviewing, case studies, recorded documents, open-ended questionnaires, and journals. Quantitative methods use standardized measures that fit diverse opinions and experiences into predetermined response categories. This approach measures the reactions of a large number of individuals to a limited set of questions, thus facilitating comparison and analysis of the data with the help of close-ended questionnaires, attitude scales, rating scales, and postal surveys. The qualitative-quantitative debate has persisted in the field of research. It has been more of a philosophical debate than that of research practices. Qualitative methods have been the subject of considerable controversy among social scientists. The philosophical and theoretical perspectives which underlie qualitative methods include phenomenology, naturalistic behaviorism, and psychology. The philosophical roots of qualitative methods emphasize the importance of understanding the meanings of human behavior and the socio-cultural context of social interaction. This method estimates validity, reliability, and objectivity of a social situation and tries to picture the empirical social world as it actually exists to those under investigation, rather than as the researcher imagines it. Here's the corrected "the researcher imagines it to be." A large number of works on qualitative methods offer the use of this method in the context of counseling and family therapy. Various qualitative research methods like ethnography, case study, grounded theory Minnis, 1985, Marland, 1989, Coldaway, 1990, and the methodology of critical reflection put forward by Evans and Nation, 1989, are considered to be more promising in this context. In recent years, the debate has softened. A consensus has gradually emerged that the important challenge is to match appropriate methods to research questions and not to advocate any single methodological approach for all research situations. Both qualitative and quantitative data can be collected for under the same study. 2.3.2 Triangulation Approach. As a reaction to the debate between the qualitative and quantitative approaches, significant research has highlighted many flexible and eclectic approaches. One of the eclectic approaches in counseling and family therapy research is triangulation. The choice of research methods follows not from research doctrine, but from decisions in each case as to the best available technique. The problem defines the method used, not vice versa. Equally, no method, with its own built-in limitations, is used exclusively or in isolation. Different techniques are combined to throw light on a common problem. Besides viewing the research problem from a number of angles, the triangulation approach facilitates the cross-checking of otherwise tentative findings. As you know, the qualitative approach puts more emphasis on participant observation, open-ended questionnaires, in-depth interviewing, and analysis of documents. On the other hand, the quantitative approach uses close-ended questionnaires and survey methods for the collection of data. As a precaution against subjectivity in both approaches, the triangulation method insists on cross-checking the important findings through the use of different techniques, coding and appropriate checking of open-ended questions, and independent interpretation of data by different members of the research team. While using this approach, theoretical principles and methodological ground rules can be discussed and made explicit, criteria for selecting or rejecting areas of investigation can be spelt out, and evidence can be presented in such a manner that others can judge its quality. This method attempts to eliminate bias or error, and as a result, increase the probability of a truthful explanation. There are three major goals of triangulation, namely convergence, inconsistency, and contradiction. Convergence is the first goal of the triangulation approach. Here, the result of data collected from different sources, methods, and investigations are combined to provide evidence about a single phenomenon. Inconsistency refers to the inconsistency among the data. Often, multiple measures produce conflicting evidence that does not confirm a single proposition. Contradiction refers to the data collected from various sources being not only inconsistent, but also contradictory. In the context of distance education, some of the research problems are complicated, often confounded with a variety of interlocking variables. Sometimes it may even be difficult to carry out the research. A triangulation method may prove effective in dealing with a variety of variables. For example, a researcher wants to study the development of the distance education system during the 90s. She has to consider a variety of interlocking variables pertaining to instruction, management, and logistics. The variables associated with the instructional system are learning strategies, instructional materials, feedback and support system, etc. In the management system, the components are organizational structures, policies and procedures of an institution, leadership, and use of researchers. Finally, logistics include technical quality, program delivery, and instructional environment. The researcher uses the triangular approach for increasing the validity of research findings. She uses multiple methods and multiple data sources. The approach helps the researcher to eliminate bias or error and as a result increases the probability of a truthful explanation. 2.3.3 Component Analysis Approach. The term component refers to one of the features or parts of a system. For example, in the distance education system, the components are learners, instructional materials, support services, etc. Here, the components that directly affect learners are of particular interest for research. It begins with an analytical phase to identify the nature of each component and how they possibly interact. Once the components are identified, it is possible to determine the contribution each component has towards the overall effect. For example, a distance education program has the following components: I, a printed course package, T, a set of audio and video cassettes, E, access to counseling sessions, and I, a set of policies related to admission and evaluation processes. The above components work together to produce a particular effect, I, achievement, rates of course completion, etc. Suppose a researcher wants to determine which of these components are most important in producing a particular effect, say, completing a program. The first stage in component analysis research would be to analyze each component in the course to determine whether it exists at a level of quality. For example, to determine the instructional components in the printed package, one has to analyze the well-written objectives, clear presentation, and self-check questions that match the objectives of the components. It may be useful to begin research work with formative evaluation than to determine the overall effect of a program. Component analysis approach is a good way to combine the benefits of evaluation with a potential program of more generalizable research. Coldaway 1990, 394. 2.3.4 Model Building. Model building approach provides ways of addressing important research questions that are ignored while designing the framework of research. It serves to integrate various knowledge bases together. Information outside counseling and family therapy can also be used to guide decision-making. Calvert, 1989, proposed a conceptual framework indicating relationships between various input, process, and outcome variables. The framework helps to construct a model of a distance educational research program. Model building for distance educational research is useful to begin with a research problem and to predict the difficulties in conducting the research and to estimate the reliability and external validity. 2.4 Let us sum up. In this unit, we have discussed the need for research and have focused on the four paradigms of research. They are empiricist, interpretive and critical paradigms, and phenomenography. The major approaches to research in the field of counseling and family therapy, namely the qualitative and quantitative approaches, the triangulation approach, the component analysis approach, and model building, were also elaborated upon, and their advantages outlined. 2.5 Glossary. Phenomenology 2.6 Interpretive Understanding of Human Action.